Thanks so much for joining us today for the Again Book Club. My name's Jory Lewis. I'm the editor-in-chief of Adi Magazine. For those of you who are just getting to know us, Adi is a weekly online literary magazine with the mission of rehumanizing policy. Our Again Book Club is a space for policymakers, activists, and politically engaged writers to reflect on a book they return to for inspiration and provocation. Today, we're discussing Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, whose name I never know if I'm pronouncing correctly, but I think that's a similar thing for everyone. We're discussing it with the author of a column on that book, Layla Mohamed, our fiction editor, who is based in London, right, Layla? And the writer Melissa Chadburn, who you're based in LA, right? So it was a little bit of a challenge to get the timing correct. So this is the two ends of the world, so the middle of the day. But we'll drop their bios in the chat so that you can read about them. The first half of this event will feature a discussion between Layla and Melissa about the book and about Layla's column. And in the second half, we'll open up to questions from the audience. We invite you to submit your questions at any moment. You can put a question in the Q&A section, and the chat will also be open so you can kind of discuss among yourselves if there's some interesting thing. So we'll be looking around at the Q&A and taking your questions there. So this event will be recorded, as you may have already heard, and will be available on Audie's YouTube channel after, so that you can return to the conversation and relive the magic. I'll let Layla and Melissa take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction, Jory. I appreciate that. I should warn you all, I am outnumbered by dogs today. So at any point in time, we could be overcome with a bunch of barking noises. But for now, they happen to be sleeping. Anyhow, I'm so happy to have this discussion with you. As after reading your essay, I can see how there's so much overlay within our work. And in your essay, you write about your frustrations with the British education system, or rather, your role as a tutor being similar to that of which was outlined in the text in the traditional sort of banking system of education, where you were to fill your students' minds as receptacles, which brought to mind all that was not included in your own education about racism in the UK, as if slavery and contending with racism was only a problem here in the American West. And I wanted to know if you could elaborate that on a bit here, just to set the scene for us a bit, as I think many of us have this perception of the British education system as having a kind of rigor, or being able to afford a kind of rigor, as it's not distracted with high student loan debt or lack of medical benefits or childcare, or lack of childcare rather. And I suppose what I'm getting at is that in my imagination, the British system is poised for the kind of teaching that Freire advocates for. And can you offer examples of the type of teaching and learning that you encountered?
Great. Thanks, Melissa. That's really interesting to me because I think that kind of shows the British vision as put out there, but I see kind of Britain as very rigid in that you kind of have that class system that really is paramount in the UK, and that leads to kind of a shepherding people down specific lines. And I think that's the issue that our education system has. So I think that's why I kind of feel it can't be as expansive as kind of what Freire advocates for. I think of my own like high school education, for instance, and particularly history lessons where, we kind of skip over any mention of empire, or whereas we had a very long detailed module all about the US, which I still remember was called A Divided Union, all about like the 20th century America and what's going on there, without any mention of civil rights movements happening here on the ground in the UK, which I only learned about researching myself privately. And I think there's that's why you have this lead on to today, where we have this very contentious racial relations in the UK, but we continually brush them aside and act like each incident is new, as opposed to linking it to this pattern in history, because it's not something that we're taught about. Um, and then I kind of went from that system in my high school. And what you'd call a public school in the UK, we call a comprehensive. A public school in the UK is like Eton or those very posh ones, so a very different system, to going to Oxford University. And there I was educated amongst people who had gone through the private school system, which again is smaller. You think again would allow for that dialogue and then more education. But then the people I would meet who had come through that system were again very small-minded in their thinking, if I could say that. So had a very limited worldview, weren't able to think beyond their own experiences because they'd come through this bubble education that was just about that depositing. And then so after I went through university, I briefly tutored, and that was when I was in that position of depositing education into others. One particular thing I remember is there was a young black student who I tutored who was very, very bright, but also, high energy, rambunctious, would like to have a conversation. So if you could engage him on the topic or discuss it with him, he would get very interested, and it was very clear how bright he was. But teaching him, I kind of had that zoom out moment of seeing, oh, within the school system, I'm sure he's not getting recognized that intelligence. He'll be seen as just a troublesome or have that label put on him. So I think that's kind of my experiences of going through that registration system.
Thanks for that. Yeah. That there's a lot of similarity to that, and then also similar to your experience. When I was reading your essay, I brought to mind a recent piece I had published in Audi about my difficulties with in academia, specifically with an advisor in graduate school. She's a person who's highly respected in my field, and which is ironically like heavily aligned with critical theory and the Frankfurt School scholars, and including decolonialists like Freire. And while I was in my qualifying exams, she'd pulled me aside and she just demanded, like, why are you here? Is it for the degree? And which is hilarious. In my experience of getting edited on this piece, the editor suggested crossing out that sentence, is it for the degree? Because obviously that's why people go to graduate school, is for the degree. It's inferred. But I was so baffled by this question and so eager to please her. I wanted to give her the right answer. And she finally said, well, there's only one reason to be here, and it's because you want this life. And again, I was so curious, like, what did she mean by this life? I envied her life. I mean, she had $1 million home and a very nice place in Los Angeles, and she, was her life, or she has a tenure track position, and she has, the MacArthur Genius Grant. And so I was like, but I think by her life, maybe she meant like a life of an internal life, like of thinking and reading and writing. And I was so much in the habit of doing, which brings us to this concept of praxis in the text. In revisiting the text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I was so pleased to read his definition of praxis, which is part reflection and part action. And I always claim that much of my scholarship, especially much of scholarship overall, but especially literary scholars, is born out of discourse. It's all about discourse, or this reflection piece, that meaning contributing maybe to an ongoing conversation, whereas my scholarship and many others whose scholarship I respect is born out of activism. Which brings me to a great quote from the introduction of the text, or my version of the text, which I'll just hold it up here, which is this Penguin version. Which is the insidious process of decoupling critical discourse and action legitimizes not walking the talk. So I loved really reconnecting with this book, and especially, now that it's summer break and I'm planning for my next courses. A common challenge as we face is, how does one engage in this form of of praxis, part action and part reflection. Um, and so when I heard, like in school also, we had to talk about our intervention. And when I heard this term intervention, I thought my intervention needed to sort of solve all the world's social problems. I formerly reported on the child welfare system, so I thought my intervention needed to solve the child welfare system. But I'm a literary scholar, so actually I'm limited to textual interventions. Um, and so what was neat about this book is that Freire breaks down the process by which to go about teaching a praxis based on pedagogy. Um, one being self-reflection, and then two is this concept of conscientization, which is a process by which learners develop critical consciousness of social, political, or economic contradiction that shapes lives, and then finally to help set the conditions of producing a new life or a new set of arrangements where power has been. And I think one way this translates to your work is that you, I've learned, are an editor. I believe it's Kosovo Republic Press. Um, and I wanted to know if you can speak a bit about the press, the work you do there, and the role this plays within the broader editorial landscape or publishing landscape.
Yes, definitely. So, Kosovo Press is a Black-owned publishing company. So, it was started in Nigeria 20 years ago, and then we kind of came to the UK in 2016. And it's very much been around the idea of, so the founder, Bibi Bakari, she says, she wants Black people only the means of production around our own stories. So, this idea of building a publishing infrastructure that's not reliant on white gatekeepers or white mitigators, and put it in Ferrer's terms, the oppressed controlling everything and giving that power to the oppressed controlling everything and giving that power to the oppressed. So what we've done there, as I've been there, we've kind of grown what we do. So before it was kind of just building the archive of the future, being deliberate about what you choose to publish as a publishing company, and being able to publish the books that maybe wouldn't make it into the world, if it were purely mitigated by whiteness. And that means being very deliberate about building an archive of the future. So the things that we publish today or the books are available. Any decision you make as an editor, you're shaping what books and knowledge is out there in the world. So having that be part of the consciousness and mind. For instance, we have a book this year that's this week is shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is very prestigious literary prize. And that book was rejected 54 times before it came to us. Yeah, and it's a book, a debut writer in her 60s, and the book is about her childhood, autofiction, her childhood growing up as a British Jamaican girl in Bradford in the north of England. But it's really a hilarious book, very readable, has had great reception with audiences now that's reached a wide audience. But the reception she was getting consistently was, oh, we don't know what to do with this book as a publisher from these traditional white publishing companies. Which is why it's so important that, people own the music production, have these companies exist. So what we've kind of done as we've grown is looked into how we can make sure we're not the only ones doing this or build up or have more and more of these companies. It's great to see that the African publishing landscape has grown so much in the last 20 years with so many of these independents coming up, and we're really actively trying to support that. So we've had an initiative called Being Black in Publishing, where we host sessions or webinars and encourage people to join the publishing industry and explain the reality of what it's like and kind of demystify it. Another great initiative we ran was an African Women's Editorial Workshop in 2024, where we went to South Africa and we invited 10 African women from across the continent to come to learn for 10 days about editing the book. They got to work on an essay that's going to be published as part of it. And it's really trying to seed that on the ground and develop more homegrown editors and publishing companies and continue and build a publishing industry by itself that's unmitigated by whiteness.
What's the title of the book that you were referencing?
The Mercy Step, sorry.
The Mercy
Step, yeah.
Oh, no, thank you so much. Well, that's fantastic. The literary landscape is a challenging one to navigate. I was I'm reading for a prize right now, and I was at a literary festival over the weekend, and someone from the small press asked me, like, how much do I care about the front matter of a book? like blurbs and stuff like that. And I was like, I give zero fucks about that. Like, please, I would really like us to get away from blurbs, actually. I think that that's just completely inequitable, and not all writers have the same access to
Yeah.
blurbs. I mean, why should the fact that I have, a a musician, or a celebrity say that they like my book have anything to do with the text. So
Yeah.
thank you for your work in that area. There was a quote in your essay that really struck a chord in me. You wrote, there can be no doubt that they are the most intelligent race in the protectorate, though it may be urged with some justice that they are also proud, treacherous, fanatical, and vindictive. Colonized by the British, the Italian, and the French, Somalia has undeniably been oppressed, but that particular dehumanization of the oppressed that Freire writes about, the one that leads you to look up to your oppressor and aspire to be like them, is something that the Somali spirit balks at. It is why the Somali response to being called garbage by Trump was a collective shrug. And I thought how liberating it must be to be without this need for recognition. One critique I have of Hegel and many of the work of theorists from the Frankfurt School, which is rooted in Hegel's thought, which Freire writes of, is this idea of the subject-object split, or the oppressed and the oppressor, is that much of the praxis people call for relies on recognition from the subject or the oppressor. And recognition itself, this act of recognition, is hierarchical in that it must be bestowed upon the oppressed from some higher plane. So I see it in myself often with this experience I had with my advisor. I desperately wanted her to be interested in me and interested in my work, and she just wasn't. And I understood that this is a huge question. I understand now that this is a huge question I'm posing to you. But is people pleasing an American affliction? And how does one get away from it? Sometimes I get this really mean case of the wants. A desire for more things or more accolades or more publications, and a colleague and a close friend of mine will gently point out that it's the capital elves that have taken over my mind. So I'm just wondering, yeah, what's the solution? How do we get
Yes,
it?
I mean, a part of that is I think I got it through my Somali nature, kind of, I see it as a bit of inoculation where we're just a naturally very prideful people. So I always say, people talk about imposter syndrome, for instance, or kind of when I was at university, people always ask, oh, do you feel awkward here? Or do you feel like you don't belong? And I always found this such a strange question. And it's not necessarily that I think I'm so great or that I'm so grand, but I think I really do have that idea that we are all kind of humans equal at that level, and that um, you don't then put that hierarchy kind of breaks apart when you have that mindset. But I think like the wants is something I have all the time, we all have, and that's something I think that we can't escape from, just living in the world that we do. And I do think that people pleasing as a whole isn't necessarily, a great evil, it's kind of where you direct it. So has that person earned your respect, or is it automatically from this place of falling to that societal hierarchy and assuming that they have the status or something that makes you put them on that pedestal? But I think this is why I really like Freire's conception of kind of the oppressing as having agency, right? So it's not about this being bestowed from below in Freire's conception. It's about you are the ones who have to do the changes as the oppressed who have the responsibility to even save the oppressor, and how he phrases it. And I think that leads to this idea of if you have a strong sense of self, if you have achieved that so he talks about dehumanization a lot in a way that I'm still kind of coming to terms with. But I think his idea that by being oppressed, you're being dehumanized. I think this is one way that it showcases it, is that you are instinctively kind of lowering yourself or having that attitude. And it's when you come to your sense of self that you can then push back against that idea.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, for sure. I When you were talking, I also recalled I had just not too long ago I heard the author Ocean Vuong speak, and he was saying, like, and he spoke about imposter syndrome a bit, and he just said, you know, I don't have imposter syndrome because if I ever feel like I'm at home in the center of the room with all these gatekeepers, then something's wrong, you know? Like, I'm not going to strive to be like chill about that, or aspire for that. So that was helpful to hear. Um, Now, there's been a lot of discourse lately about people not reading anymore. And yet you have returned to this text again and again. And I really appreciated how Jory mentioned this column overall about texts that we return to again and again. And part of my desire to encourage is to encourage close reading. So can you share like anything new that came up upon rereading or your experience or overall your experiences with rereading?
Yeah, so I think obviously working within publishing and books being my profession, I'm really invested in that question of what can we do to make sure people are reading and reading closely. Um, I think reading is so deeply impacted by feeling, right? So the mode you're in or where you are in your life as you read the book. I think that's also made it so easy to return to Pedagogy of the Oppressed in particular. I think when I first read it, I read it in a spirit of almost vindication, of kind of saying, ah, yes, this is articulating a lot of frustrations that have been built up in my mind that I haven't seen put to page in this way, which in a way it leads to quite a surface level reading. And then I have the book in front of me. It's such a tiny little book, my edition, but it's just so dense. And each time I read it, I find there's something new to pick up or something I might maybe glossed over before. I think subsequent readings have allowed for more of a both close and more critical reading. So kind of asking questions about the terminology he uses, or and lately I've been really focused on that conceptual praxis which you opened with, and what it means that that's the key to becoming human. Because while I agree with the concept that you can dehumanize yourself, dehumanization is something I've always maybe seen as more of a what happens to the oppressor rather than the oppressed, which is very different to how you conceptualize it. So something that I've been thinking about more as I really closely, and which actually you sparked a bit in my mind when we last spoke. So that was interesting to think about.
Yeah, I a couple new questions have come up for me. I've been very interested in the idea of necropolitics, Achille Mbembe's um, scholarship around necropolitics, the who should live and who should die, sort of that idea, which I think he mentions necrophilia in the Freire's text. Freire mentions necrophilia, but I feel like that is also sort of some way to establish this idea of dehumanization. It's easy to allow one to die when they are not considered human. And Butler writes about this a lot as well, especially during COVID. It was interesting to read this text to post, our experience with a global pandemic. So yeah, in terms of like, I think Butler was commenting on um, the market sort of being humanized, and for fear of the market, like we need to get these people back to work or these first responders back to work. Anyhow, I wanted to open up the discussion for questions, but before we end here, I wanted to know, I'd love this, I really enjoy like sharing recommendations. So like any recommendations you have for a book or otherwise that have brought you joy, or sort of like if you like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you'll love X. So, and I'm happy to share some as well. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. If you don't mind a bit of a shameless plug, so there's a book called The Shipikisha Club, which is published by Design Books in the US and which we're publishing in the UK, which is about, it's called The Shipikisha Club, about a woman on trial for the murder of her abusive husband. Shipikisha is just a really fascinating Zambian term. It means endurance in marriage. So when Zambian women get married, they say to each other, welcome to the Shipikisha Club. That's kind of cool. So, which I found really fascinating. And I think the book asks questions about what happens when that interest is too much, and it really explores how women can uphold the patriarchy in society. So I think that kind of speaks to various themes of the oppressed and oppressor dynamics and getting caught in that trap of replicating how things are. And then what brings me joy, so what I like to kind of escape from and free my mind is going for a walk. So I'll go for like 3 hour long walk in the forests or get lost in nature and just kind of escape from the world. So that's kind of when you're reading the news too much or when you've been doom scrolling, I think touch grass, as they say. I highly recommend that.
Oh, I love that so much. I live near the Pacific Crest Trail, so people stop in my town to like get their goods that they send to themselves when they're walking from Canada to Mexico. So, uh, but what's hilarious is that I don't walk very much, but people from all over the world come here to walk. Um, but I This year I was introduced to the wonderful work of, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Marie and Jai. Um, and and when I was reading this novel, The Witch, which was republished in English and translated by Jordan Stump, and then, like I mentioned previously, I participated in the Lit Festival this past weekend, where I came upon the small press, uh, Two Line Press, which exists solely because they explicitly wanted to publish her long form work because she would submit work to them for their journal, and it was always way too long. So they established Two Line Press. And so I'm looking forward to reading this earlier text of hers. So that's my recommendation. And then also, like many of you, I'm craving a slower pace, something that resists technology or the algorithm and all that comes with it. So I've recently picked up cross stitching. And here is my latest attempt. This is my very first cross stitch. I'm not, okay, there you go. It
I
says
love that.
So it's very clumsy looking. It's clear that it's my first attempt. It's still in process, but I just wanted to share with you all. And then I'll put like the link to the pattern people in the chats for you. And if you can put a link in the chat also for how we can purchase that text that you mentioned, the book that you mentioned. Um, and now I'll move over to our questions. All right. Anonymous attendee says, I'm interested in the state as an educator and ways of resisting intellectual chaos in the form of blatant lies, AI, revisionism. How can we apply ideas to how we learn and dialogue civically, etc.?
So I think this is the question of the time, right? Your cross stitch kind of speaks to this of the AI, and it's something that I'm somebody who has never touched any of these like chatbots or deals with them at all. But it is kind of terrifying how quickly I've seen it be normalized, taken over everywhere. And I think this is why when you're just teaching people to take things in and learn, as opposed to teaching them to think, then this is what that opens up for. So I think if you are having an education that's built around critical thinking, around having the conversations on the topic and not just these are facts to memorize, it's knowledge to learn, then it's harder for AI to get around that and have those tricks. And I think that is an education that we need to build, one where people can recognize the traps of AI, because people, who I think of as very intelligent or normally very reasoned people are buying into this AI very uncritically, which I think is quite terrifying to see happen. And I think, it's having one-stop source for your knowledge and assuming that that works, which is why I was supposed to kind of back in the day of having to do multiple sources and trouble-checking facts. I think there's some key skills that would get lost there. But I'd love to hear your perspective as an actual educator who's working within that space, Melissa.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Uh, I've definitely built a pedagogy that's AI resistant. I have a strict device policy in my courses. We don't use devices. And uh, and I had to deal with like this um, really rigorous accreditation process where we took all of our first year seminar students who work that had to meet the writing requirement and applied a rubric to it. And one of the the most difficult sort of rubric parameter to find in our students' writing was around intellectual inquiry. Yet I have my students I have a social responsibility practice in my courses where I do community engagement with my students. We go out into the world and when they write about it in their piece, and that is the one thing that has always brought in their work up to meet that level of intellectual inquiry. I just recalled like early on in teaching, I had one of those terrifying experiences where I looked out into a room full of students and they just looked bored, which is like, who wants to stand in front of, 30, 20-year olds and they look bored out of their mind. At the time, I was teaching a journalism class, so I was just like, all right, pack up your stuff, like, let's get out of here and go into the world. And then that's when I developed a course I called The Human Condition. And um, early on, I had a friend, the same friend who's mentioned that the capitalist elves were taking over my brain. She was like, Melissa, we're in La Jolla. Like, don't worry about teaching them how to be good writers. Just teach them how to be good people. And she said Kathy Acker used to just take them to the food bank. And I I've since learned that's revised. Like it wasn't that I needed to teach them how to be good people. They were already good people, but I needed to create opportunities for them to express that. Um, and I do teach a course now on journalism and creative nonfiction and a long form practice on witnessing and how to develop a witnessing practice um, when you're when you're experiencing or engaging the suffering of others. Where does one begin and end in when writing creative nonfiction? So, part of that is, again, witnessing doesn't begin and end with sight, just like praxis doesn't begin and end with reflection. So, those are my ways of doing that. Now, another question. In Layla's essay, she writes, despite the never-ending talk of diversity, there's little appetite, even among Black writers or tastemakers, for the work we are interested in doing, building systems of our own, unmitigated by whiteness. How do we combat this lack of appetite? What vision do you have for beginning to build these new systems?
This is a really tricky one, especially within publishing, which I wrote an article in like a trade paper about the bookseller, which is like the publishing industry trade paper in the UK back in 2020 about how publishing must decolonize. Because I truly believe that of all the creative arts, it's one of the most deeply colonial, storehouse rooted. It's very much built on not kind of sending knowledge from west to east, as you would say, or in terms of how many books that we distribute worldwide and self-translate to, as opposed to how many translations we publish, for instance. So even as I talk about, my key also be building more institutions like Star Public or these owning our own means of production, but we're still working within that publishing system, which as a whole I do find like deeply colonial. So it is a very tough question. I do think that lack of appetite comes from kind of what we spoke earlier of buying into that hierarchy. So, Black writers will assume that getting published by a bigger known or white publishing house has more value to them. And that's a mindset that's very difficult to change over time. And so I think they see the success of publishing companies and we build more of those spaces of our own. So I think in a way there needs to be a sort of parallel publishing industry happening where you're selling directly to the people where you're building. And then, it's the capitalist elves talking there, but I think only when people see that success in a material way, will they acknowledge that that's something worth building, contributing to.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I wonder about this question a bit. I mean, I wonder about the question of appetite, because it's like it's very hard to discern what's if what we're seeing has anything to do with appetite. It's not like a supply and demand situation, I mean, I think we have um the market oversaturated on one end um with, narratives that who knows about if it's a question of appetite or a question of the marketplace in general. I think, for instance, I I got a very low advance for my novel. Um, and a friend of mine was publishing at the same time I was publishing, and um, he was able to secure this very high level publicist within the industry. This guy Michael Takens, and Michael Takens, I think you have to pay. I think his rate is like $20,000 or something like that for to hire him. And I it didn't make sense for me to hire a publicist that was for more money than I got in my advance. And my publishing house did provide me with a publicist, but I thought I'd sit back and see how how his book was received as opposed to mine. Um, we're both people of color. I'm Black Filipino, he's Jamaican, um, and uh, and we both came out of the same graduate school. So, it's and he wrote a sh short story collection, whereas I wrote a novel. So, historically, short story collections kind of don't sell as well as novels. But I was watching TV and I was watching And Just Like That, which is like the sequel to Sex and the City. And Sarah Jessica Parker, Carrie Bradshaw is walking around holding his book. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's what $20,000 gets you. So I feel like I don't know if it's necessarily appetite as much as it's like a marketplace situation. I don't know. There's just so many intervening factors because I think that there are people out there who are desperate to find sort of, yes, engaging, like rigorous literature that is decolonial in nature, but not, but the market is so saturated. You have
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think what she talks more about is kind of that building the system. So the appetite for so when I spoke of appetite for this change, it was more,
Mm,
as a writer thinking out black media, are you thinking of the means of production behind it? Are you thinking, will this come from a black company or this has been or are we thinking of supporting actively black writers in a very real way, not just the ones from the big publishing houses or the ones that have that big publicity. So being very deliberate in our choices, as in what we seek out. So I
mm,
think there are cases where I've witnessed where a black author, for instance, will put up with a level of disrespected bad behavior within a white publishing industry
mm,
infrastructure, but they'll assume that's how things are. Whereas if they were met by the same circumstances with a black publishing company, the response would be very different. So I think there's some ways in which there are these internalized ideas that I then see play out within the publishing industry. But yeah, there's a lot of issues with the publishing industry of gatekeepers, of publicity needing money. So many books publishing industry. There is it's a very crazy industry that doesn't really make any sense when you think about it too much, unfortunately.
yeah. But there's so much potentiality there, I
Mhm.
believe. So,
Yeah.
um, I have a question for both Layla and Melissa. Could you talk a bit about, sorry, about a bit more about your writing lives when you first came across pedagogy, and how the book continues to informing your work in literary spaces where that oppression and segregation is still very much alive? Oh, that's such an excellent question. Did you want to take that one and I can start thinking?
I was going to suggest the same thing. um, I'll have a go at it. So, I mean, I think when I first read it, I had just started out in publishing industry, but I was already, so I did a couple of small internships at other publishing companies. So I did 2 weeks within one of the big five as the publishing companies, Hachette. And then I spent a month at a kind of medium-sized publishing company. And then I started working very early in my career at Star Republic. I've been there for almost 10 years now. So I would see kind of the experience that people around me were having in other publishing houses and kind of just be like feeling quite fortunate that I was within a Black-owned publishing space and that my experience of the publishing industry was a bit safer for that reason. But at that time, there was so much talk about kind of diversity was very much a buzzword back in that day when I first came into the industry and when I first read the book. And I think I was seeing those contradictions within the publishing industry throughout the years after that, especially around 2020, where you had a real Black Lives Matter peak, and then people were talking about, suddenly we have to give all these Black writers big advances, we have to publish them more. And then if you look at the data now, we're publishing even Black less writers in the UK at least in 2016 than we were pre-2020. So it was very much this temporary dip and fall. So I think that the way this book talks of, practice of action, putting systems and what we do across our public has really, I've just kind of been seeing it in action over the years of my work and publishing industry and around the creative world.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, I, so this book lives in my mind with like, I had, I was like, had a huge political education in my early 20s. And I just recall like reading Audre Lorde's Zombie, Another Spelling of My Name, in this book, and like smoking cigarettes. And I was coming out, and I really thought that's what it meant to be queer too. Like I could just go to Cuernavaca with a bunch of other women of color, and we would just write poetry and smoke cigarettes and eat mangoes. And so um and that was like th that was what I was about. And at the time to here politically, I think we were doing a lot of work around Prop 187 and Prop 209, the Contract on America, and work against NAFTA. And I just I and then I mean I worked for I worked for the Communist Party in the US, and a big part of my job was to go around with older Bolshevik women who had pink rinses and go to their house and ask them to write their living will to the party, or like make a donation to the thrift store, like to donate their lamps or something to the thrift store. And we organized a huge protest against the war, actually. And but you know, and then how that translates to now. Well, one, I feel so far away from that in some respects because I've joined academia in a kind of way. Like I went on and got a PhD, and I now teach, and but I'm still kind of precarious because I'm not tenure line, I'm visiting. And um so it's nice to revisit this now because I can catch myself when I am sort of seeking, I'm positioned to still seek that recognition from the oppressor in a way, like financially. Um, and then also, though, it's nice to really like recall to make this part of my praxis in literary spaces. Like I taught a course on literary communities last semester, and we went to sites of cultural production that also practice mutual aid. Um, like we have a bookstore here in Pasadena called Octavia's Bookshelf, and they offered a bunch of mutual aid to people who experienced the fires of recent. Um, and so yeah, I think that uh, I could deal with a bit of rereading every now and again to just one, remember like that fun spirit of being with others and community, and pushing back, but also find ways to incorporate it in my teaching. I mean, I also was like, let me redesign my whole class right now to accommodate this text. Um, but everything always goes back to dialogue. Um, and that's been a real benefit to be reminded of that touchstone. Um, I think when I was younger, I, you know, I've matured now. So I used to be like I've since learned that it's like awareness and then sort of acceptance and then action, where when I was younger, I would skip the acceptance part and just be like aware, like, oh, I'm uncomfortable about this thing, and like split straight to action without that sort of like reflection piece that Freire talks about. And now I think that I'm older, I'm able to press pause a bit and do some deeper reflection and engage with the larger communities, and then work on action together.
Yeah, actually, you said that reminds me. I think I was very similar age. I read it when I was in my early 20s, first time, and that was when I was on Twitter a lot back then, which was obviously always a mistake, and it was just a very kind of high energy, active, reactive place. So there wasn't that time for thinking through things where you just be bombarded by people's discourse and takes. So I think there was a lot of anger and a way of reacting to things very instinctively in my mindset. And I think that's why I mentioned earlier when I pressed with the book, it was with that spirit of vindication. And I think as I read it over the years, there was like a softening to how you approach the book as you mature and kind of, I think I mentioned the essay, you realize how much it talks about love in the book and having a pedagogy of love, whereas I was reading it from a very rah, rah, angry place initially. So yeah, as you grow mature, I think definitely the way you engage, you experience text will develop with that. And that's the
Yeah,
power of rereading.
I'm so glad you mentioned love too, because it's like Bell Hooks pedagogy was born around that. And yeah, I always tell my students like our job is to like just love the shit out of ourselves and each other and like what's the best way to do that. And I don't think that you can do that in a school that requires students to have, $100,000 worth of student loan debt, for example. I mean, Bell Hooks was also able to go on and teach in a school that offered free education. And ideally, there would be more of that. And I think that's the cool thing too, is now that I'm older, I'm able to um, implement more stuff like that. Like, what are ways that we can offer free education for our students? Whereas when I was younger, I would be like, "Where's the protest? Can I take my top off?" And um, okay, final question. Well, this one's a juicy one. I don't know. Are you able to view these questions as well?
Yes, I'm having a
Okay.
lot of
I don't think I'm using this function right. I think I'm supposed to be clicking buttons. I'm just going.
fun.
Is it better to develop responsible use of AI instead of banning AI, and how to turn AI to be a tool of liberation? Is AI phobia or banning student from using AI a good thing? Layla, what do you think?
I mean, I would say that the idea of AI as a tool of liberation, I think, is off the table entirely from my perspective. Regardless of using it or anything, or there's a point where you can say people can use it regardless, and we make work
Yeah.
around that. But I don't think something like that can ever be a tool of liberation, personally. Even if you just think of the climate impact of AI, the reality of the exploitation it's built on as a system, I think that's something that we can't then repurpose and reclaim and say works for us. I think that's something that gets missed in the position of AI, where it's so much about the late stage ethics of it, of our mindset, and we're not learning, but actually just as a system on the ground, the capitalism of it all, is something that I think can't be overlooked and ignored. So yeah, the idea of it as a sort of liberation just does not seem right.
Yeah, I wouldn't know who would be liberated by it, but yeah, I'm not I really can't fathom a way that it can be of service to the human again. Again, we're talking about human-centered work and like, and again, if our job is to be loving, how does AI love that? Love that. How does AI move that? Like, how does AI increase or add to our experience of love in the world or with one another? And I just don't see, I feel like it's another barrier. Um, so we're about finished in time here. I wanted to hand it back over to Jory for announcements for the book club.
Okay, well, thank you for that beautiful conversation and ending on the AI question. It's something we've really been talking about a lot too. I will say, just a small aside, I mean, I think, especially in terms of pedagogy, the thing about learning is actually doing the thing, right? So if you're using AI to shortcut all of that work, I'm not sure how that liberates you. Instead, it's like, I don't know, enslaving you to
Yeah.
AI itself. That's my own perspective, because I think writing especially is a puzzle. So I don't know why it would be satisfying to have AI do the puzzle for you. You know what I mean? Like what's the point of that? But um anyway, thank you everyone for this great conversation. We host these book clubs every month featuring a different book. On the calendar for our next event is The Bluest Nude by Ama Kojo, and that will take place on August 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern. We've gone back and forth on times, but this will be at 7 p.m. Eastern. In conversation with the poet Ali Ong and Adi's poetry editor Levin Osman. And we hope to see you then. We'll drop the link, I guess, to sign up for that in the chat, or if you get our newsletter, you can sign up there. But thank you so much, Melissa and Layla, and everyone else who joined. And we hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye.